Good morning. This presentation is about the good governance initiative that OW2 is launching today at OW2 Online. At OW2, an initiative is a joint effort by members and non-members to address a market need. The need we're addressing here is that of large end users to implement open source governance policies. And the whole session this morning at OW2 Online is in fact an outcome of this good governance initiative, and most of the speakers today are participants in the initiative. So what I want to do today is look at the context that managers in charge of implementing good governance policies are confronted to. So we will look at what is the state of the open source industry they are looking at, and what are the key challenges, and then we will identify the main trends and priorities of the good governance initiative. So the general consensus is that open source has won, not so much at the level of the operating systems, but throughout the whole information system, and that's what we at OW2 we call full stack open source. So that means there is open source everywhere, but that doesn't mean that open source is the same everywhere. And in fact, the open source supply we're confronted to comes from 4 different models that have emerged over the last 30 years. The first model is that of the community open source or the free open source. That's the model by developers and for developers that has given us some of the best and the most popular open source components. For instance, the internet would not run without open source software developed by these communities. The second model is that of the commercial open source. So free software in the 80s, started in the 80s, and in the middle of the 90s became commercial open source. And commercial open source is carried by companies, by software vendors that leverage the open source business model to compete against proprietary software vendors. So these have changed the shape of the software industry. And then towards the 2010, with cloud computing and everything being interconnected and all innovations being dependent on other innovations out there, something else happened, that large companies whose name would never be identified with open source software started to open source their own technologies. And they started to team up together to invent new technologies. And this is the whole cloud computing wave literally was fueled by collaborative efforts by large companies leveraging the benefits of open source as a vehicle for collaborative innovation. And that's what I call open source by committees, where trends and decisions are made completely collectively. The next level happened like a year or a couple of years ago, with big money coming into open source software. Open source being recognized as part of the industry, traditional board members representing pension funds and people you would not suspect to be open source activists have authorized the managers to invest billions of dollars in open source companies. It's not so much Microsoft acquiring GitHub or IBM acquiring Red Hat, but also investments in startups and valuations of open source companies beyond the $1 or $2 billion thresholds. Today, we have in fact 4 models at play concurrently. So as a manager in charge of implementing an open source governance policy or organization, it's important to understand that there is not just one open source, which is the community open source by and for developers, but that we also have open source provided by the big companies and also open source provided by commercial software vendors that use this open source business model. And that's something that is this it's a heterogeneity that has to be taken into consideration. So I would say this is the state of open source supply. I mean, the high-level vision of open source supply. And today, this open source context is confronted to what I would call crucial challenges. And I identify 10 of those. So the first challenge is, of course, about reusing open source components and knowing what is in the component that we reuse. So controlling the software that you reuse in terms of its security, in terms of its license, or in terms of functionally that it doesn't break the rest of the software development cycle. This is something very important, and there are tools for that. The next challenge is that posed by software as a service. The software as a service model takes away control from the code to the service, and where in-house teams used to control the code, they have to hand over the control of their applications to service providers. And where SaaS and cloud computing takes control away from the cloud to the services, the next challenge is that posed by artificial intelligence that takes away control from the program to the data. Artificial intelligence is fueled by data, and the center of gravity is shifted from the program to the data, and programming becomes, in a way, secondary. The next challenge is that posed by IoT and the fragmentation of open source software. We're out of our comfort zone of middleware and operating systems, and now we're seeing open source into segments that are very fragmented, into very business specific applications, or into very hardware specific specifications. And that fragmentation limits the possibilities for mutualization, which is the basis for open source software. Next, there's what I call deviation. Those deviations come from the opportunistic use of open source software to create foundations in order not so much to do open source software, but actually to create technologies that would work together and would take prevalent market positions. So these are not really open source organizations. These are really technology and business organizations made for grabbing market shares. And now there is another deviation from the in the open source software, which comes from a new interpretation of open source licenses, saying that current open source licenses are obsolete, and that now we need to get to the stage where we need licenses that control exactly what we do with the software. And that is something that I feel is beyond the scope of what open source is about. Next, there is that of the free riders. So you know the tragedy of the commons. Exaggerate use by consumers or users of free resources leads to the ruin of these resources. Now, I would look at this from the standpoint of our ecosystem, and I would say that consumers who don't give back to the communities tend to ruin the supply of open source software. So the idea, the whole point here is that of having a sustainable ecosystem, and it comes from not being a free rider. Next is related to the shape of the structure of the industry. Well, open source software is an avatar of the proprietary software industry, and the proprietary software industry being dominated by the North American industry, open source software is also kind of driven by North American interest. Next, also we have to pay attention to is that of thinking that open source has won and that everything is going to be open source. No. Open source only represents 15% of the whole software and service industry. It may be a question of monetization and measuring the value, but the thing remains that the center of gravity of the whole IT industry is not in open source, and that has to be taken into consideration as well. And talking about the industry, you have to understand also the structure of this industry. There are many companies, large companies, small companies. It's an imbrication of ecosystems. And what's important here is to understand that some companies are keystone players with their hands in many ecosystems, and that other companies may be niche players, very important, but belonging to only one ecosystem. That helps understand who we are dealing with and help understand how we engage with our ecosystems. And the last one is the trend, next challenge is the trend to outsource IT operations. Outsourcing tends to take away control and culture from inside, from the company development teams to the IT service provider or the IT outsourcing service provider. And the thing is, governance policy has something very cultural in it, and it's difficult to have a governance policy, a full-fledged governance policy, if when most of the IT is being outsourced. So having said that, and looking at this context, and from the standpoint of OW2, our position in the European ecosystem and our members, we realized that there was something we could do. There was something you could do because open source is there. There is a question of maturity. You grow with open source, you learn to use it, and controlling or defining this learning curve is something that matters. And from our perspective at OW2, we wrote about a year ago that we felt it was important to look after our European ecosystem, and that contributing back would be, on behalf of the large end users, a good thing to do. So we've had discussions over a year and a half, and these discussions led to identify three key needs or key drivers. So the first one was that there was a need for among large end users to raise their collective level of expertise in reusing and using open source software, and that many of these were isolated in different countries, and that having a way to share this expertise would be a very useful thing to do. The second need identified was for an accessible organization. The thing was that most of our participants were saying that large organizations, dominant organizations, are not easy to do business with, and that they needed an organization that resembled them. And the third results of this, there was a need to have something that is EU-centric, Euro-centered. So for these reasons, we felt that OW2 could be the neutral ground where we could develop this initiative and where we could host these discussions and help grow the collective level of expertise in using open source among large European companies. Because we are European organizations, we're European DNA, we have the experience, being founded in 2007, and we also have a global reach and a diversified code base that would be the proper backdrop for these discussions. The next thing to do is to identify what was out there. There was no way we would reinvent the wheel, and the whole point was to leverage what already existed. But we realized that what already existed was in fact centered on providing tools, the tooling level. And we felt that in our open source initiative, tooling was only one of the different layers that we would look at. So we are very happy to engage with all the initiatives that exist, and especially this morning in the presentations, we have presentations about the open tool chain, open chain from Linux Foundation and the tools by the Eclipse Foundation. So we are happy to cooperate, but we want also to go a little bit beyond. And going beyond would mean for us to leverage this kind of a model that we borrow from a psychologist called Maslow, that identified a pyramid, a hierarchy of needs. And this hierarchy of needs identify 5 levels. The basic needs for, just survival, living, eating, and being alive. The next level is the need for doing this security, so the security needs. The third level is that of being in society, of belonging to a society and engaging with other people. The next level is about being recognized. so it's having some recognition for what we do. And the fifth level is that of pure nirvana, is the whole fulfillment. So we are borrowing from this hierarchy to identify the different levels, the different maturity levels in terms of open source governance policies. So the first level that we need to have is that of using open source. And using open source means technically using it, having a certain code base of open source software, having people able to use this open source software. So first of all, that's the first layer is that exists. And often this layer is being developed in a way that is a bit uncontrolled. So take back control on this is the first thing to do. The second layer is that of using open source with securely, and that is using the tools, and that's all the tools that we are looking at today, to manage security, to manage license compliance, or to manage dependencies, so as to not to break the not to damage functionally the software that is being developed. Now the next level is that of belonging, and there we see that in terms of identifying where we are by comparison to similar companies, and identifying what is the state of the art in open source governance, and developing this culture and sharing best practices and implementing them. So that's something that the Good Governance Initiative would really make, where the Good Governance Initiative would like to make a difference. Then the next step, where we would be a little bit activist at OW2, is to make sure that those participants engage with the ecosystem and participate, develop their own visibility, and help create and enhance the level and the market power of the European ecosystem. And the fifth level, that of fulfillment, would be that of having open source fully recognized as a strategic asset by companies and fully contributing to the competitiveness and profitability of the companies. So with that, this is the framework for the Good Governance Initiative that we are organizing. We're launching it. We're leveraging the concept of Open Source Program Office, OSPO, that captures what, I mean, it's a good context for developing governance policies. And the priorities that we have identified was, first of all, to help grow this OSPO concept or organizations within our participants. The next one is to address developers, to make sure that we have responsible developers, and we're developing a training syllabus for that, training syllabus that will also be useful for open source governance managers. The next priority is to identify and create a set of resources for managing compliance and sourcing. And this is what really the session today is about, identifying all the resources for implementing governance policies. And the next priority is really to engage with the European Commission, so that together with OW2, the European Commission, the large end users, we engage with the EU open source ecosystem to make sure that we have a virtual environment that is sustainable and provides good and secure and reliable open source software. So that's what the Good Governance Initiative is about, and we will be developing our activities throughout the next few years. Thank you.